In part 1, we talked about some basic scientific principles, and I warned you that there are some special considerations to keep in mind for psychology, like how humans are not an ideal study species. In this video, we're going to keep on talking about science and actually get into doing some of that science, how we can measure variables, as well as what variables are. So how do we get the data that we're going to use in our research? Well, we measure things. We're going to obtain that information by observing and quantifying the world around us. And now the textbook makes the point to differentiate scientific observation from casual observation. So casual observation is maybe you stand outside of your building and you look around and you observe that it's warm today and there's a little bit of a breeze and maybe it's sunny, and you just make a casual note. Whereas with scientific observation, maybe you'd go outside and you'd have a thermometer with you. You'd know that it is precisely 21 degrees outside. Maybe you have a device to measure the wind speed, so you know how strong the wind is blowing, what direction it's blowing in. So scientific observation is going to have very precise measurements, and these methods of measuring should be repeatable. So if you go outside again later on and it's still 21 degrees or whatever outside, you should be able to use your thermometer and it should tell you that it is still 21 degrees. Precise and repeatable. Now I've mentioned the term variable, or if I haven't, I will be doing so quite a lot in the upcoming slides. But a variable is just the scientific way of talking about any characteristic that can vary. So if I'm talking about a variable, I'm just saying a thing that we can measure. So you could use stress as a variable. If you're measuring how stressed out students are and you're measuring their stressedness on a scale of 1 to 10, that's a variable. Height could be a variable, because again, you're measuring it and it can differ between people. And when we're looking at variables, especially when we're trying to do research, when we're starting to collect data, we have to start by setting up what's called an operational definition. And this is when we define a variable, the thing that we want to look at and measure, in terms of specific procedures that we're going to use to produce or measure it. So if I'm talking about height, how are we going to measure height? Maybe we're just going to use a really long ruler. Or maybe we have a special device that will calculate height based on, I don't know, the angle of the sun. So an operational definition should be a description of that property in some kind of concrete and measurable term. It might seem kind of silly to talk about operationally defining something like height, where if you told people that you were measuring people's height in, say, centimeters, they'd kind of figure it out. But in psychology, we don't necessarily use as easily defined variables or characteristics. We might use something like personality or mood, or, like my earlier example, stress. So when we're trying to set up research, we have to tell people, what do we mean when we say we're going to study stress? Are we going to use a survey where people fill out questions and we can quantify how stressed they are based on their responses to those questions? Maybe we're going to use a physiological measure, something like muscle tension, to determine how stressed they are. In order to do good research and let other people know how we've done our research, we have to use our operational definition to let them know exactly what it is that we're looking at. So in addition to wanting to have an operational definition that makes sense, what else is going to make a good measurement? The first thing that we want is reliability. We want a measurement that's always going to produce the same measurement when we're measuring the same thing. So just like the example when I was talking about using a thermometer and measuring the temperature. If it's 21 degrees, your thermometer should always tell you that it's 21 degrees. And if it does, if it's consistent like that, then it's going to be a reliable measurement. Our next trait is validity. you want your measurement to actually be conceptually related to the thing that you're trying to study. So muscle tension would be conceptually related to stress, so it would have high validity. But if you're using something like, I don't know, how much somebody is smiling, maybe that's not as closely related to stress. Might be a little bit related, but it isn't the most valid measurement that you could use. And then our third thing that we're looking for in a good measurement is power. And power is the ability of a measure to detect the conditions that you specified in your operational definition. So if you say that you want to measure muscle tension to study stress, and you're going to be using a particular way of quantifying muscle tension, if you have a powerful way of measuring muscle tension, you can tell the difference between someone whose muscles are very tense versus not very tense. But if your measurement is not powerful, then you'd have a lot of trouble telling if their muscles are tense or not. So a good measurement would be powerful, and it would let you tell the difference between those conditions you specified in your operational definition. So now that we've talked about what makes a good measurement and stuff we should be watching out for, let's take some time and actually talk about different types of measurements. And a lot of these are going to be biased towards what we would use in psychology, again, for obvious reasons. So let's start off with the self-report. The self-report measures involve participants reporting on their own knowledge or beliefs, feelings, experiences, or behavior. Basically, you're going to ask the participants, the people who you are surveying, the people that are going to be part of your research, you're going to ask them questions. Sometimes in a questionnaire where you can give them a list of questions on paper or online, or maybe in an interview. So you can ask them, what do you think about X? Where X is any topic that you want to know their opinion on. Surveys and interviews have long been used by psychologists and other researchers because it's a pretty good place to start. Doesn't really need specialistic equipment. If you can find a person and ask them questions, then you can conduct a self-report. So it's easy to see why we use it fairly often, but we should also keep in mind some of the issues, some of the downsides of using these self-report measures. So the biggest of these is something called social desirability bias, which is basically the idea that people want to make a good impression. So when you're asking someone questions, if that question is phrased in such a way that the answer might make them look bad, then maybe they're going to lie about it. So maybe you're asking a question about how often they drink, and they don't want you to judge them for drinking too much, so instead of telling you the actual amount, maybe they tell you a smaller amount. Now, as a researcher, that's really frustrating because now all of a sudden the data that you're collecting isn't accurate. You're not actually measuring what you're trying to measure, you're measuring what people tell you or what people think you want to hear. So that causes a lot of problems. So how do you deal with people giving you dishonest responses? The first way is that you can change the way that you're asking your questions. So maybe you word it so that even if they answer correctly, it doesn't make them sound like they're socially undesirable. You make it so that one answer isn't better than another, and they're not going to lie on that basis. You can also guarantee participants what's called anonymity and confidentiality. Basically tell them that no one will know who they are, no one will know that they participated in this study, and that their responses won't be linked back to them. And sometimes, by telling people that no one will ever see their answers and know that they're theirs, they'll actually give you more honest responses. So that's always pretty good practice when giving a kind of self-report measure. You can also, again, modify your questions and start including questions that test for dishonesty. So maybe phrase the question in a different way and see if you get the same answer. Or ask the question multiple times and ask the opposite question and see if you get the opposite answer, that sort of thing. You can adjust your questions to determine if a particular participant is honest or dishonest, and you can reasonably then assume it's okay to throw out data from people who are lying in these reports. You could also, to avoid this social desirability problem, give the survey to someone other than the person you're interested in. So maybe you want to know about Bob, but you're worried that Bob won't be honest. So you can give the survey to Bob's partner. Ask them all these questions about Bob and their behavior, and the partner, because the questions aren't about them, they might be a little bit more honest and give you more truthful responses. So that's another way to go around this social desirability bias. And that's to deal with the fact that your participant might not be entirely truthful, but there are other issues to consider, like the kinds of questions that you're asking. And sometimes, if your survey isn't well designed, the way that you're asking questions can encourage people to answer in a certain way. So you can ask a leading question. You think that Nickelback is the best band on the planet, right? That's a leading question. You might not always get the answer that you have led them to give, but the way that it's set up is going to bias the responses that you're getting. So you always want to watch out for suggestive or leading questions, or even unclear questions where people might not know what you're getting at. So some things to consider with these self-report measures. The next kind of measure is another tried and true scientific measure, and this is observational measures. So you're going to measure overt behavior. And here, overt just means observable and easily measurable behavior. So an overt behavior could be you count how many steps someone takes, or you see how often someone smiles, or you see how often someone goes to the grocery store. Things that you can observe and record. Now, to conduct these measures of overt behavior, you're going to need some observers, people who are actually going to watch the participants and record their behavior. Now, these observers don't have to be people. You can sometimes use a video camera because that's going to record the behavior. And nowadays, we can actually use computer programs to go in and measure different behaviors automatically, removing the human element entirely, which will be useful when we start getting into some issues on the next couple of slides. But in order to set up these measures of overt behavior, we have to make sure that we have a good operational definition of the behavior that you're looking for. So if you're measuring how often someone smiles, you're going to need a threshold that's going to tell you the difference between a smile and, say, a frown, or a smile and a grimace, or some other facial expression that involves moving your mouth. So your operational definition should make it very clear what counts as the target behavior, the thing you're observing, and what doesn't count as that behavior. And if you're using human observers, you're going to have to train them so that they can consistently code what they're seeing. They have to know that operational definition, and they have to be trained to follow it. And I suppose the same is true if you're using a program, a computer, to do the same kinds of classifications. That program needs to be programmed. It has to be trained to tell the difference between the things you want to tell the difference between. And by having good training and a good operational definition, that's going to give us very reliable and consistent measurements. Basically, if you set up a good experiment or a good study, and you have these very well-designed measures, then you're going to end up getting consistent data. Now, of course, we can now talk about the issues that come with measuring overt behavior. So just like when we talked about that desirability bias in our surveys, participants can change their physical behavior as well. And when we talked about the issues with humans and the fact that we are reactive, where we behave differently when we're being observed, that really messes with these observational measures. So if somebody knows that they're being watched, maybe they're not going to behave normally. And if you're trying to get at someone's natural behavior, if you're trying to measure their natural behavior, again, it kind of defeats the purpose. And just as for our surveys, we were talking about the desirability bias, we have a fancy term when we're talking about people changing their behavior as well. So we can talk about demand characteristics, which are aspects of an observational setting that are going to make people behave or change their behavior to act as they think that they should. So if they're in a room and they know that they're being watched, maybe they're more likely to give up their seat if a pregnant woman comes into the room. Or maybe they're more likely to be friendly if they know they're being watched. So these demand characteristics are telling us that people aren't behaving naturally, and our measures of their behavior aren't necessarily giving us an accurate representation of natural behavior. And just as we could talk about ways around issues with our self-report measures, we also have ways to get around issues with observational measures. One of the best ways to do this is use what are called unobtrusive measures. Basically saying that you use forms of measurement that don't let people know that you're watching them. So maybe you're going to use a hidden camera. So people won't change their behavior because they don't know that a camera is present. Maybe you're going to use an observer who is blending into the surroundings. Maybe they're reading a newspaper and they look like just another person in the room with you. You don't realize that they're part of the experiment. Though it is important to note that some of those deceptive techniques are going to fall under the category of ethics, which we'll talk about at the end of the chapter, because it's not really ethical to be monitoring people's behavior without telling them. But we will come back to that later on. Our next type of measure is an interesting one because this isn't one that you would usually think about when you're thinking of research. But this is archival measures. This is when we make use of pre-existing records or documents. So for example, maybe you're going to use school records to try and investigate something like the effectiveness of different teaching strategies. Or maybe you want to look at birth records to look at morbidity in different areas based on the doctors that work in those areas. So archival measures allow us to make use of stuff that's been measured already. And this is fairly common to see, especially in earlier psychology, where it's very hard to get large data sets. And so it's very nice to be able to co-opt or make use of records that other people have taken for other reasons. So school records are going to exist whether a psychologist wants to use them for a study or not, so why not use them as well? Same with birth records, or I always think of different genetic tests, countries that keep track of people who have been born, who have been diagnosed with different genetic disorders, and who they're related to. And that's a major part of how we understand a lot of modern psychological disorders that have genetic components. And that all comes from these archival measures. On the limitation side of things here, we're limited to records that already exist. So you can only study using pre-existing databases. So you can't magically create a database that works with what you want to study. You have to choose to study something that already falls within the information that's already been collected. And again, you can run into some ethical issues here because you need to have permission to access the resources in those databases, especially when it comes to personal information and things like who people are related to, or even more protected if they have particular disorders. So there's a little bit more to it than that, but it's good to keep in mind that these measures exist. And the last one that we want to talk about are psychological tests. So these are very specific to psychology, but not exclusive to psychology. And so psychological tests are, as you might imagine, specialized tests that have been designed by psychologists to measure a particular variable. And psychologists love making up these tests. They have things for personality tests to try and categorize you on a bunch of different personality traits. Intelligence tests, things like IQ, or maybe problem-solving abilities, or all sorts of things. They also have psychological tests, things that would help them diagnose abnormal brain function. So how do you perform at different problem-solving things? How do you make connections? Things like that. And that brings us to the end of our discussion on measures. And I want to take a moment and just say that there are lots of types of measurements, and this isn't an exhaustive or all-inclusive list. Each type, as you see, has lots of advantages and disadvantages, and researchers are going to choose their methods of measurement based on the type of research they want to do, the questions they're asking, the resources they have available to them, all sorts of different factors. And sometimes researchers are going to use multiple measures to give them a little bit more certainty in their findings. Next, we're going to start talking about actually getting into different kinds of research, making use of these measurements, and going from there. I'll see you then.